me how you really feel, cause I just wanna build with you. Black girl, tell me how you really feel. I just wanna keep it real with you. Yeah, I wanna live better, eat better. I wanna love better, sleep better. Yeah, I wanna feel so aligned. Sublime. Sublime. I wanna live better, eat better. Sublime. 1 time for elevated rhymes, 2 times for showmanship, 3 times for black hands and land ownership. Revolution I bring to you, where the ring bling to you. Nixie blues on war tunes, singing to you. I am the rebel without a pause, no applause. Trust me, I am Chuck D, getting mine off. Many fools, they clock watching my moves, and I needed a reappraisal of flavor. Took some time off now. Back Jesus, black fetus, slumbering unborn. Ark of the covenant, curtain untorn. I'm the rose that etches prose in Rosetta Stone. Still yelling it through a megaphone. Always repping, baby, forever home. I ain't the pot calling the kettle black. I am the flame keeping the kettle warm. I'm the blame for the renaissance that's cold. I write and recite it with down feathers on. I love you, and write and recite it with down feathers on. That mean that shit cold. And I'm the coldest. Listen, it's the message right here. Black boy, tell me how you really feel, cause I just wanna build with you. Black girl, tell me how you really feel. I wanna keep it real with you. I wanna live better, eat better. I wanna love better, sleep better. Yeah, I wanna feel so aligned. Sublime. Y'all give a round of applause to this band right now. When they tell me they want to feel the chords a little more than we got.
Good evening. Good evening. I'm still trying to get right. Good evening, guys. Hope you all are well. Thumbs up in the chat if you can hear me okay. I know I do that every time, but I'm trying to make sure my mic is dialed in the way it's supposed to. Because sometimes my mic just does what it wants to do. So shout out to the chat. RM, I see you. Michonne, I hope I'm not butchering your name. I see you. Tanisha, I see you. S. Dot, I see you. Doc, I see you. Thank you all for being here. I'm doing my best to honor my commitment to stream every single Friday, like I said. I'm not typically in front of the camera. That's not necessarily my ministry, but there's value to be had. So, I will show my face. I'm super excited about our guest today. Ironically, I was actually a fan of his before this newfound, notoriety or recognition. So, I'm really excited to pick his brain. Brilliant brother. He has created a vocabulary for some of these conversations that we're having, some of these concepts that we've been struggling with for a long time. So I think we're probably going to ping pong around, but the kind of the belly of the conversation is the son-husband or husband-son phenomenon. So I'm really interested in what Dr. Johnson is going to, or how he's going to elaborate on that and help put it in context for us. As always, make sure you guys like the stream. Make sure you guys share. This week's videos were were interesting. We had some returning guests. Well, they're not actually returning. It was just another part to their interview that hadn't been posted yet. Yesterday was you must not like, or you must hate black women, or you must hate women. And then Tuesday was CIA plus FBI. So those are really good videos. Y'all make sure to check those out. And then Monday, of course, we had the conversation with the Jalea, with the girl who curved the nuclear physicist. So check that out as well. A lot of YouTubers talked about what happened. we were lucky enough to actually talk to the person that was involved. So I was excited about that. And I think it was a pretty good conversation. We had Courtney Michelle pull up. Courtney Michelle's the GOAT. We had ZZ pull up. ZZ's the GOAT. And it was cool for me to at least sit back and watch women have conversation amongst themselves. Women check each other and women put each other on game. It's cool to watch. Eds, I see you. Paul, I see you. Yeah, it was really cool to watch. I'm thinking about kind of chopping it up because it ended up being a damn near 4-hour stream. We're not doing 4 hours tonight. I'm actually trying to stick to it because I need to get to Atlanta. I'm working on something tomorrow. I wanted to kind of get a head start on that. So I was thinking about leaving tonight. If not, I'll leave in the morning. But yeah, so Tuesday's video, the actual title is No Jumper. The thumbnail title is CIA FBI. We touched on, the confident, intelligent, assertive acronym that the late Kevin Samuels came up with, the feminine, beautiful, and inspirational acronym that he also, I don't think he came up with it, but he popularized those acronyms. And it was interesting to dialogue with her about her thoughts on that. I saw some of the comments. Those are interesting. And then I was really excited about Thursday's video because we brought up the anti-Black antebellum Black female tropes, the Jezebel, the Mamie, and the Sapphire. So, for me, this conversation must have a Black historical context. So whenever I can include that in a conversation, I'm really excited, and I'm really excited for people to see that. So, yeah. Let's see. Any housekeeping stuff? Again, I must continue to thank you guys for all the support. Every comment, every super chat, everything really matters. And yeah, you guys are keeping this ministry moving. All right. I just want to jump in. Without further ado, I introduce to you guys the one, the only Dr. T. Hasan Johnson. How you doing, sir?
I'm good, man. How are you?
Man, I'm doing fantastic. I'm excited.
And I appreciate you having me.
Absolutely. I appreciate you being here. I really appreciate you being here. I'm excited for this conversation. Even when we spoke off camera, the thing that stuck out to me is you said your primary goal is to create a vocabulary around this conversation.
Right.
To help formalize these issues that we're having as men, these issues we're having with our women, these issues we're having intergender, issues.
Right.
I want to learn more about that. Like, when did you kind of decide, okay, this is my ministry, I need to keep going in that direction?
Well, I've been teaching at the university level for 24 years now.
Wow.
And it actually didn't become my ministry until a few years after taking a position here at Fresno State. So, I've been teaching, as an adjunct for some years, finished my doctorate, went out on the market, and I came to Fresno. And I was probably a couple years in. And at the time, most of my research was on hip hop. Now, when you find your sort of life's work, your unction, as it were, you'll find that you usually have been doing it in one way, shape, or form long before you knew that's what it was supposed to be.
Yeah.
So I was doing hip hop, but really I was keying in on Black males, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I brought a hip hop group, X Clan, to Fresno State, and they performed, and they were actually staying at my house. And I had a couple of students over, and we were watching a film called The Diary of a Tired Black Man. And so I'm sitting there with Brother Jay and some of the other members, and we're talking about the film. And I noticed a couple of my students, they were first years. In fact, they were actually sitting there, but they were talking about, a whole different conversation. And I noticed they were talking about, strange as it is, trying to make sure my language doesn't doesn't disrespect your platform, but
No. Listen, speak your piece, speak your mind. Be free, please.
okay. Well, they were talking about the sexual expectations of the women they were dealing with, and one of the things they kept talking about
Mm.
was how whether it was black or white women, there was this ongoing expectation that they, as black males, engage in rape fetish.
Hmm.
And so in the midst of all of that, I'm listening, I'm half listening to them, I'm half talking to Brother Jay, but I start keying in on to them more and more until the whole room is listening to these two young men talk about what girls are expecting them to do. And in the midst of this conversation, it dawned on me that the line between what girls wanted from them and what could get them locked up was a very questionable line. And I realized that nobody was talking to them. So one of the things I started doing was thinking about, okay, is there a way I can actually start support these young brothers? And I thought about, as a teacher, of course, doing a class. But the problem with a class is they got to read, and some might not even take the class because they have to read. So I ended up creating both a class and a group at Fresno State for these brothers who are on campus. And so in doing both, I really kind of found myself in terms of what I'm here to do. And so as far as the vocabulary issue is concerned, what I realized is I was trained as a black feminist doing my doctorate. And really, I'd been introduced to black feminism going back to my first year in college. You had to get it whether you wanted to or not. I mean,
Right.
many of these scholars were required reading, and nobody really cared how it impacted black men. We were told, if anything, by these, elder women, black women who were in women's studies, they were in Africana studies, and they were teaching the same thing no matter what they taught. So you ended up getting this heavy dose of feminism. And what I would be told when I didn't even have the vocabulary to ask the question the way I wanted to, but I was essentially trying to say, what is it that black males, what can we use to make sense of our situation? And they would just say, well, use what we developed, use the feminism. That's appropriate. That'll help you. And really all it did is, kind of make us prioritize black female interests, but it really didn't speak to our experience. And so when I started teaching the black male class for the good first couple of years, I noticed a dwindling number of black males and an increasing number of black females taking my courses. And I came to find over time that they would take my courses to hear me browbeat the young men about the things they were upset about. Right. And so the men stopped taking the class. And when I actually started
Like church.
Well, hey, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And when I started actually listening to the men and letting them foreground the discussions in a black male studies course, I found the numbers of black males started to go up and the numbers of black females started to go down. Right. And so that kind of helped me kind of push to see, okay, well, there's something here, because the black males didn't have the language to say what they were trying to, but just in the attempt, black women were less and less interested because they only came for me to browbeat the men. But when the men started to explain their experiences, they didn't like that. And fewer and fewer of them would take the class. And then we started actually working on a vocabulary to explain our experiences. And it meant stepping outside of the black feminist paradigm to do that. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
So I want you to help give us context to where we are today as far as the black male female dynamic or the black male female dysfunction. What is the best historical context you can give us as to where this comes from, where the necessity for a manosphere even comes from, where the women's current disposition comes from?
Well, one of the things we talk about a lot is the role that institutions and policy play in our dynamic. See, it's one thing to say, well, niggas ain't shit, black men are trifling, or, black women have bad attitudes, or they're horrible this or that. That's surface level. But when you get past that, at least from a black male study standpoint and a black manosphere standpoint, what you get to is the dynamic is shaped by generations of policy. So whether we're talking about who has access to birth control, we were talking, I mean, black men in general, we're still operating with the tools we had in the 50s. I mean, we're in 2022 talking about the pullout method. Meanwhile, women have, 5 major forms of birth control and over 35 forms, and that doesn't even include abortion. So, and right now, the big issue on the table is that, access to abortion is questionable, but men are still over here operating with a piece of rubber. You know what I mean? And so, who has access to that? Who has access to welfare resources? Who has better access to college admissions, white collar jobs, consistent employment? Who has resources given to them? Over the last 3 years, we've been talking about all the programs that have been designed and targeted specifically at Black women. Do you know, after 3 years of asking my listeners to identify a Black program, a program targeting Black males for resources and opportunities, like specifically, especially since the pandemic, I really should say, today was the first email I got answering that question.
Oh,
and it's
wow.
a program in Chicago that would give money to poor Black men to lower crime. But the problem is it hasn't even passed yet. And apparently the mayor is resisting it. So here we are looking at various programs and opportunities from Goldman Sachs to Google to MasterCard, giving billions of dollars in job preparation for Black women, even up for the next 10 years. And Black men have one program in Chicago that they're considering, and it ain't even passed. And the Black female lawyer is the one resisting it. So these are the kind of things I'm talking about, right? And what happens when you have 4 to 5 generations of Black families that are seeing Black males kind of being pushed, into irrelevance, or at the very least in a position of, not being able to even really sustain themselves, let alone a family, right? Chronic unemployment, right? Things of this nature. What happens whether you're poor and you're accessing, welfare resources that men can't get, especially when we know about the man in the house rule that prevented that, or whether you're middle class and you're talking about college access and you have a primary female teaching base from kindergarten through graduate school. What happens when the data suggests that boys learn better under male teachers, girls learn better under female teachers, but the majority of teachers are female? Well, theoretically, you would see a crash in quality of education for boys across race, which, by the way, we do. The Black males are at the bottom of that list. So, when we look at the institutions, we look at the various policies, and there's a list of them. These things have impact over generations. And one of the things it affects, among many, is women's perceived attitudes and perspectives about Black men. And so one of the things I argue is we're at a place where Black men are perceived as disposable resources. You're an essential component when it comes to, sperm, if she has a desire to reproduce, maybe marriage, if that's something she wants to do. But we've gotten and developed a culture in the Black community where men are, they're almost accessories to some extent. Right. And so in the midst of all of this, you have 40 years, at least, if not 50, of women in mainstream media telling Black men everything they've done wrong, telling Black men everything they need to do right. You've literally had 2 years of Black men responding. Prior to social media, we haven't really had a platform. So I was born in the 70s. If you were raised in the 80s like I was, you heard everything under the sun about what Black men did wrong. And there was no platform, maybe except for hip hop occasionally. And I say hip hop and comedy. Like those are two places where you might hear some pushback against some of these narratives. But the problem was the majority of Black men would have to filter them through individual artists. So you had to wait for a certain rap group that might have something to say about Black men and their experience. You had to wait for a Tupac to talk about his experience with women. You had to wait for an Alexander O'Neal in R&B to talk about his experience with women. You had to wait for an Eddie Murphy to talk about divorce and how it impacted men. You had to wait for those artists to do that, a Chris Rock, a Dave Chappelle, but you filtered all that through them. Whereas Black women had everything from magazines, even to this day, TV channels. If you look at BET, Her, and TV One, they're targeting Black women. They're not targeting right? So their stories are being told, and they've been told since the 80s. Black men, not so much. It's been real inconsistent. And the other problem with hip hop too, especially in the 80s, is you were filtering these stories through relatively young men, 17 to mid 20s, speaking for a mass of men across age, across class, you know what I mean, across geography. And there's only so much you're going to get through a handful of 18-year-old, 20-year-old rappers. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So social media opened that door. And so now you have men that are speaking for themselves, and the world has gone apeshit. Everybody's upset left and right because they're
not used to it.
Hear it. They're not used to it. But we've been listening. I mean, it's funny to me when, you talk about Kevin, people would talk so much about his tone. And I did an unofficial poll on my channel. I said, all right, fellas, from teachers, Black women teachers, to family members, to women in positions of authority at the institutions you were at, tell me about their tone. Brothers lost their mind. I don't care if you're talking about mothers, about grandmothers. I don't care if you're talking about the principal at your high school. The tone was off the chain. And y'all mad about one dude on YouTube for 2 years who was speaking to the mainstream, you know. And the funny part is that the level of vitriol at him, you would think he would have produced as much as Oprah at this point. Oprah got a channel. You know what I mean? She's been identified as a billionaire. He was on YouTube for 2 years in terms of his mainstream contribution.
Right.
And everybody went nuts. And I'm like, really? Because if that upsets you, there's a lot of brothers that ain't been heard for over 40, 50 years who got a lot to say. And they have not been given mainstream stage. And the last thing I'll say to answer you, most of us, and you're probably evidence of this as well, we built our channels by ourselves. There's no corporate funding. There's no channels. There's no Hollywood entities supporting these. These brothers built their channel and taught themselves how to do some of the most incredible graphics and, you know, out of scratch. Kevin himself built his channel out of really the way we all did, maybe some advice from each other. That's kind of it. There's no serious funding behind this.
Right.
And yet, you know, folks are pissed off at what brothers are saying. But my issue is not whether or not everything everyone says in the Manosphere or Black Male Studies is something I agree with. My push is that it deserves to be heard after the 40 years of bullshit I had to grow up listening to.
Yeah.
It needs to be heard. It needs to be said. And I don't care if you like it or you don't like it. These brothers got a right to speak.
Absolutely. So, I mean, my next question for you before we get into kind of the main topic, one of my theories has been, you know, you hear a lot of women's disposition, even in my interviews, like some of their pushback is that women are doing so much better than men. Black women are doing so much better than men. And part of my theory has been that our women's current disposition of like being disagreeable, being unwilling to hear anything at all that's less than exalting about them is because, you know, it serves to kind of further, number one, drive a wedge between Black men and Black women, fulfill corporate interest, and emasculate the men. It's like a perfect recipe. So can you help add context to that? Am I tripping, or is there something there?
I tend to approach it more from the political end. Put it to you this way. So no matter what people think about the civil rights movement, it was the last movement that we saw in the African-American community where you had people across gender, geography, class, ideology, you know, occupation, color, right? Ability, you know, in terms of what we used to call handicap, and you know, and sexuality, right? This was the last major movement you saw where Black folk as a community, on the basis of being Black, came together and said, we have needs and issues that need to be addressed. Well, one of the things we talk about is right after that, the way the feminist movement in particular put a wedge in the community in terms of splitting the notion of Blackness and gender. But they weren't the only one. You know, if you look up Dr. Bobby Wright here on YouTube, he talks about that split. He talks about it from the 1980s. And he said a lot of people don't understand what happened in the 70s. So you had the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. He said the 70s came along and wiped us all out. And what he meant was, whether you're talking about gender, whether you're talking about, you know, the educated elite, whether you're talking, you know, he named several different, the student protest movements, the political movements. He talked about how each one of those specific groups was split from within. So when we talk about on my channel, the issue with Black men and women, I'm not a relationship counselor. I'm not. That's never my forte. I'm not professing to be one. What I talk about, again, is the way policy was used to split the community in a lot of different ways. And we see the evidence of that split now. So whether it's LGBT, whether it's feminism, whether it's class-based, whether it's education-based, whether it's income-based, whether it's employment-based, there's so many different ways that we're split apart. None of that was accidental. And one of the most dangerous ways of doing that is to provide resources to one part of the community and withdraw it from another. So one of the things I talk about is, you know, when you look at the 70s and 80s, when, you know, at the same time we saw Black women going to college in unprecedented numbers, we had the war on drugs. And where did Black men go? They went to prison or went to the grave, right?
Yeah.
This is the split. So in as much as you have women celebrating their quote unquote ascendancy, you also see Black men living a very different quality of life. And that's a strange reality, to be in the same community, but we live a very different quality of life from one another. And yet some will deny we do. And I can show you the data that proves that we do. But here's the thing, to your other question, your beginning question is, when we look at this whole notion of Black women doing better, and this is something that Rebecca Lynn Pope recently jumped into, you know, saying black women are running circles around black men.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, it's ridiculous if you look at the data, because here's the thing. Black males are still doing better, but they're not doing better because they have support. They're barely doing better in spite of a lack of support. So if you look at the BLS data from 18 to 65, black men still earn more than black women for employed black men. The problem comes in when you factor in incarcerated black men. So black women earn about 63 cents on every white male dollar. Black men who are employed about 68, 69 cents. But when you factor in incarceration, we make 51 cents. Right. So we're the only group of men that technically make less due to employment. But for those employed, they're actually doing better. You know, the black males are actually the predominant number of entrepreneurs, but it's recently been celebrated that black women are the rising group of entrepreneurs. But few people know there are actually more black male entrepreneurs, but very little support for those black male entrepreneurs. So you have an apples and oranges kind of dynamic where black men are not doing as bad as, well, I'll put it this way. We're not doing as bad as we probably should be with all the obstacles we have.
Right.
You know, without those obstacles, of course, life would be a whole lot different. But the perspective on black men is the problem. Perspective is that all black men are doing horribly, you know. And so when I listen to these channels that are talking about how well black women are doing and, you know, 6-figure black women, I'm like, y'all know there are more black men earning 6 figures than black women, right?
That's a fact.
You know, but if you live in Atlanta or LA or New York, you might be fooled going to a restaurant, a high-end restaurant, and you see 6 sisters sitting together making 6 figures, eating a posh dinner. Right. That's a very different thing than the majority, right? And then when you factor in that black women do go to college in much higher numbers, they tend to have much higher debt, school loan debt than black.
That's a fact. That's a fact.
So you might be comparing a highly educated, white-collar job working black woman who makes 6 figures but also owes 6 figures in debt, figures in debt, to an electrician who may make $75,000 a year, but he has no school loan debt. He spends the majority of his time when he's not working playing Xbox and chilling with his boy. You know, that's the, you know, so we're talking about apples and oranges, but we really have to actually look at the data to have a better understanding of who we are. But the perspective on black men is based on stereotypes that go back to the 1960s. And these are stereotypes that Dr. Tommy Curry has framed in some of his recent works. He deals with what's called the subculture of violence theory. And what it talks about is there were racist white scholars that framed these different definitions of black men, these different ideas about black male deviance with no empirical data. They literally made up ideas about black men. And black feminists in the 70s and 80s picked up those ideas, incorporated it in their work to make the argument that black women were suffering as much as white women in terms of patriarchy, right? And Dr. Curry actually names the names of the people involved, from the white scholars to the black feminists. He identifies the publications where this took place. So that language actually comes from racist white scholars. And then after that, this obscure group of black feminists who are writing these publications that are castigating black men get popular. And they get popular through your Oprah Winfrey's, your Terry McMillans. And Oprah was kind of the spigot that really released this obscure black feminist idea on university campuses into mainstream culture. So that's where you end up with everyday black women who've never picked up a Patricia Hill Collins or Bell Hooks book, but they know the talking points from watching primetime television. You know,
Color Purple, yeah.
Absolutely. And so those ideas really got propagated during that era. And, you know, you end up in the 80s with niggas ain't shit, and it still exists in varying forms to this day, despite how well or how poorly black men are doing, given a specific context.
So is there anything black men can do independent of our women's cooperation to reverse the trajectory that we're on?
Well, I think we're at a point where really for the first time in my lifetime, I'm seeing black men coming together in a way I never have, publicly and fairly widespread, and not limited by national boundaries. I get reached out. I mean, I get people reaching out to me from South Africa, from London,
wow,
from Asia, from Australia, South America, and all over the US. Black men reaching out to me, African men reaching out to me and saying, we got the same thing going on here. You know, what can we do about it? And so I'm seeing brothers supporting each other's channels. I'm seeing brothers sharing information, sharing data, sharing business tips, beginning to collaborate in different ways and build new, new prospects in terms of what can be done. that to me is the beginning point. But it's still very nascent. It's very new. It's the moment is very pregnant with opportunity, but where it goes, I'm not sure. But I think that's the beginning point. Seeing black men actually comparing notes, because you couldn't really do that.
Right.
Like, you couldn't. It's a whole different reality now. I mean, now you got guys who are making $300,000-$400,000 a year on YouTube. That was unheard of in 1991. You had to have, to get the equivalent of that income at the time, you had to be a doctor or a lawyer, maybe a drug dealer. But
right.
At this point, now there's opportunity. People can rise in different ways and collaborate. And I'm actually seeing black men doing that. And I think there's a lot of potential there. So I think that's the beginning point. But it also means being unapologetic about our critiques, not only of ourselves, but of the institutions we're involved in. And that includes the family. And that's part of the issue. For the most part, there's never been a time that I've known where black men weren't being held accountable for what we weren't doing right, for what we failed in terms of other people's expectations, whether it was the larger white society or whether it was, women in your family. There's never been a time I've seen black men not being held accountable. But that hasn't been an even keeled critique. Most of the time when black men didn't like if you go back to Color Purple, like you mentioned, there were a number of black men that were highly offended at that movie. But where exactly could you express that thought?
Right. Without being laughed out of the room. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And my mother was part of that era. So she drugged me to those Oprah Terry McMillan films after Color Purple. I read the book like 4 or 5 times. I watched the movie 6 or 7 times. My mother was so excited about it. Yeah. I mean, I had, Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman on my mother's shelf. I grew up looking at that book even before I could read, So those were, but she wasn't a feminist. She never used those words. She was just one of those women that picked up on that kind of, excitement in the moment that some black women were experiencing. And I was caught in that wave, and I saw it from my household as a child all the way through college. And I watched the kind of almost militarization of women, ideologically speaking, in the academy as far as feminism was concerned. And I watched this rising tide of contempt for men, even to the point where I see it in my students. I can tell you stories about this, the level of frustration and rage at black men who haven't done anything to them. And as a matter of fact, when you actually start to talk to some of these women, they haven't even had the experiences.
Right.
They saw it in movies. They heard it from girlfriends. And yet the men that they're talking to may have actually had the very experiences these women are upset about, and they still see these men as the enemy. And so it's not surprising to me that there's such vitriol and rage that many black men feel from not being heard, that it explodes the way it has been. It's not surprising to me at all. And my statement about it is, if there's going to be some healing, y'all got to hear the shit.
Right.
Because we spent 40 years hearing it. If you got to hear it for 2 years, I ain't got a lot of pity for you. Go ahead.
So paint a picture for us as far as what could a potential future look like if we get things on the right track, and what could a potential future look like if we just continue as business as usual? Well,
going backward in your question, if it continues business as usual, I think you'll see an unprecedented split, and I think it's actually begun. I'm the father of he'll be 17 in a couple weeks, and when I look at his group, not only his generation but even amongst his friend group, the split is already real. I talked about this for several years. He's getting ready to go into his senior year, but when he was starting his freshman year in high school, he did a summer school program, and I asked him, I'm a father, what's up with the girls, and he was like, so he told me about the various girls here and there, and I said, well, what about the black women? What's up with that? And he was like, oh, we don't do that. I was like, we don't do what? He's like, oh no, we don't do that. He said, he said, they're mean to you, and that's when they like you. He said, when they don't like you, they're even meaner. He was like, they'll walk up and embarrass you in front of a room full of people, and you don't even know who they are. They'll cuss you out. They're mean to you. And then, he was like, we just stopped. He said, we just play video games. He's had a couple of girlfriends, and, they're not really black. And, when if he finds the relationship annoying or whatever, he's like, okay, I'm good. And he'll walk away, and he and his boys will just play video games. They are not, I'm telling you, the whole thing about LeBron James's son, Bronny, that's a real thing for a young generation of boys who are really not seeing they're not seeing the value and associating. And this is not just limited to the girls at a school. And I've been to a school and I've seen their behavior. It ain't a fantasy. It's real. The city girl culture is real.
Yes.
It's real. The boss bitch culture is real. You know, and what a lot of people don't understand is these girls, be they in high school or not, they're getting it from their mothers, their aunties, and so on and so forth. So it's not just happening at his level. It's happening at Ultimate, because he grew up watching me and my boys dating. And he saw the women we were dealing with. And then he saw their daughters at his school, and a lot more young men are like, anyway. So as far as the possibilities of what can happen in terms of pulling together, my hope, if there's still time for it, is that, you know, upon listening to each other, you know, that we might actually have a different table to sit down at and begin to speak with a very different tone. But to me, that cannot happen if you're going to ignore men. You can't have 50 years of men listening to you tell them why they are the bane of your existence, and then expect men to shut up and just get along because you don't want to hear what they're. And I hear it a lot. I hear, you know, I have women that'll come into my shows, into the comment sections, and they'll say, okay, well, all right, you know, there's just a lot of negativity both ways. How can we resolve this? And I'll be like, well, how long have you listened to my show? Well, this is my first show. Okay, well, how long have you listened to other men in the Manosphere? What's the Manosphere? Okay, so here's the problem. You want to come in and you want to tell folks what they need to do, but you haven't even bothered to listen. I find that to be the case even with Kevin Samuels. To this day, I have women that'll mention his name because they heard it from someone who heard it from someone else. They haven't actually sat and watched the show.
Right.
They can tell you everything wrong with him. His tone, he was this, he hated black women, because they picked it up from other women that said the same. But when you start asking, well, have you watched the show? Well, of course I have. Okay, well, which shows? Well, I haven't really watched them. You know, I saw a clip on World Star, right? Or I just heard it from my girls. When you get to the bottom of it. So again, if you have this culture of seeing men as disposable resources who are just supposed to be available to you because you exist, but you don't want to hear what they have to say, yeah, I don't think there's going to be any resolution. But if you have women that are willing to listen and not quickly dismiss what's said so we can get to the part that makes her feel good, but actually sit in it and listen and honestly engage, what Kevin would talk about as engaging in good faith, then there's a chance. But part of the issue is that there's not a lot of social incentive for many women to do that.
Right.
And when you talked about the entitlement you brought up earlier, and the kinds of systemic practices that kind of support a very, you know, solipsistic way of seeing the world, again, there's not a lot of incentive for her to be self-reflective. If she's coming from generations of women who ran households and saw men as interchangeable parts, not a lot of incentive for her to do so. You're talking about women whose girlfriends and family members would critique her for marrying and catering to her husband. Not to say he's not also catering to her, but just seeing it. Look, I've seen it happen where even a woman who brings her new boyfriend to a cookout, she so much as serves him a plate, he will get told off by girlfriends and family members. And I'm like, yo, really? So he's supposed to, protect, provide, do all of that, but even so much as bringing him a plate is a problem from your network of friends and family. How exactly is that relationship supposed to go anywhere? And men are tired of it. Even men who have never heard of the Manosphere are tired of it.
Right.
And what a lot of people don't understand is the Manosphere is like the tip of the spear. It's new. It's coining terms and names for things that have never really been named. But here's the thing. Everything the Manosphere represents is something Black men have been doing in the community for years.
Yes.
I can point you to the hardest Black nationalist, Pan-Africanist revolutionaries I know that stopped dating African-American women in 1988. They started dating, women from Africa, from the Caribbean, and they're still pro-Black. But when you start asking them, well, who you married to? Oh, I'm married to such and such. Where's she from? Oh, she's from Ghana. She's from Nigeria. She's from, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Even Frederick Douglass, like his second wife was a white woman. It's mind blowing when I found that out. Yeah.
But see, that's the core of it. That's why on my channel, I don't deal with bipartisan politics, and I don't deal with religion. The reason I'm talking to Black men the way I am is because I noticed that, again, those hardcore revolutionary nationalists and the most conservative Trump voting Black men I could find had something in common. they all had frustrations with relationships that they couldn't talk about anywhere and be taken seriously. So they made life decisions without talking to anybody, but those decisions were much the same. So the conservative might be with a white woman or a conservative woman of any stripe. The revolutionary is going to be with a black woman, but it'll likely be a black woman from another country. When you get to the core of both, usually that means getting a beer. If I could get a beer in them and we sitting down somewhere, and I've done this at conferences, I don't even drink. I'm just like, here, drink that. Here, drink another one. And when you get them talking, it's like the same exact stories. And that's what I found interesting. So I created a space where I can engage black men and boys and directly talk about the issues that affect us. And I don't particularly care what your political strike is. And most people dismiss it. Oh, you're a conservative. No, I vote green. I'm not a conservative.
That's facts.
Most of the men in my channel, vary. I mean, Hebrew, Israelite, Muslim, Christian, atheist, across religion, across political ideology, but they have the same experience of being seen as disposable resources, of not really being seen as human beings, let alone men, and contempt from women, even their own mothers and grandmothers. I have one brother who's an internationally renowned storyteller. He is well-to-do. If he walks the streets of another country, and he's been over 60 of them, they treat him like Michael Jackson. Well-established brother. He was telling me about a situation where he was on the phone with his grandmother. Everything was going well. And they got off the phone, but he couldn't quite hang up right at that moment. He was doing something else with his hands, and he could still hear his grandmother talking to his mother. And they began to talk shit about him. And this blew him away because this is, he'd never heard his mother and grandmother talking about him this way. But the contempt they had for him was reminiscent of the contempt they had for his father, the contempt they had for his uncles. And he was
who does he think he is type of?
It was a little bit of who does he think he is, and it was a little bit of, well, he should know he needs to pay for X, Y, and Z for us without them having asked him. It was a list, of issues that they had about him that they had never shared with him, and he didn't know they needed addressed. But more than the fact, because he would have happily done so if they'd have said it, but more than anything, what really hurt his heart was to hear how much built up contempt that they had that he didn't know anything about. And he said it was reminiscent of how, his mother and grandmother would talk about his father. And so I can't tell you how many black men reach out to me on that basis alone. Hell, 2 years ago, I had a banker who actually ran a series of banks reach out to me. And he said, look, man, I appreciate what you're doing. He said, I listen to your show so that when I go to Thanksgiving, I can actually respond. Because he said, we go to dinner and every year I have a family full of women that would just browbeat me under the table about all the things they're angry about. And he said, listening to you, now that I have the data, I actually refute what they're saying with that. And he said, now it's gotten to the point where it started off with them just, being debated into silence.
Right.
Because he's actually responding with data as opposed to, feelings. But then it got to the point where they would avoid bringing up those topics in his presence. He said it's the most peace he's had in years. But, I can't tell you how many men have called me with these very same situations.
So I actually had a conversation yesterday, and the young lady's response was just that you talk good. So it wasn't, she couldn't refute anything I said. So she attempted to make the claim that I'm just a good orator. So therefore, whatever you're saying doesn't matter because you just spin things into gold. So what you brought up with your son is really fascinating to me because I actually took it a step further. So my brother's 17 and his group of friends are also around the same age. So, I'm damn near more revolutionary than just, save yourself. So I actually instructed them to seek out the black girls in their charter school and, make their acquaintance or whatever. So they actually came back to me and they told me that, no, they don't want us. They want thugs. They still want the popular male archetype that we see on TVs and in rap videos. So if you could address the black female delegation, what is the potential risk? What is the because to your point, they feel like there's no benefit of black men, but what is the potential risk to them, their future, if these young boys just save themselves?
Wait, so ask that again. So say it again?
What is the risk if these young boys just save themselves, black men?
The risk to who?
To black women.
You know,
If all
Kevin,
these boys just take their business elsewhere and they say, you know what, I'm done.
you know, Kevin joked about it, but he joked about it using, you know, real articles about things that people were doing. You know, he talked about elder women, you know, older women, meaning over 35, you know, moving in together to share resources. You know, he talked about, you know, people living in separate domiciles, that kind of thing. And even though he was kind of joking, but not, that's really where this goes. I mean, because here's the thing: when you look at the dating data, I mean, if you go back to Christian Rudder's book, Dataclysms, which was based on over 1 million different couplings on OkCupid, he looked at the overarching patterns of human dating, and he even dealt with race and gender. And one of the things we know is that in terms of, you know, who really seeks out Black women, it's Black men. Nobody wants Black women more than Black men. It's just a reality. There are other men that will have sex with Black women, but at the end of the day, the ones who want to take you home and marry you are
I had this
overwhelmingly
conversation
Black
today.
men.
Yep.
It's overwhelmingly Black men. And so, you know, at the end of the day, if this split, you know, continues, if the contempt that I argue was baked into the culture continues unchecked across generations, I mean, you and I are talking about 17-year-old young men. We could just as easily be talking about 65-year-old men. And I have often. And those brothers sound exactly the same, which is why Kevin and myself, I've had some of these men across age just reach out to me crying. Like, I can't believe you said what was in my heart. I didn't have the words to say it, but every experience you talked about, I had. I got 70-year-old men coming onto my channel in the comment section saying, young man, I've been listening to you for 6 months, and I've had every experience you talk about. This is the first time I'm saying anything. You touched my heart because nobody's ever said it aloud before. You know, I got men who have been, you know, married for 30, 40 years. And within the first conversation, they're telling me about having been sexually violated. And they've never even told their wives, you know, something that happened to them when they were kids, because they didn't feel like they could trust that information wouldn't be weaponized against them the first time she got angry. So these are things that I think are baked into the culture as far as how we perceive men. And if it doesn't get checked, if it doesn't get responded to with verve, with energy, you know, at the end of the day, I think things can dissipate to a level we're not familiar with, we've never seen before.
Right.
I mean, because a lot of people think, you know, I had a sister tell me this the other day. Well, slavery broke the Black family. I said, no, it didn't. Black folk were married more than anybody up through the 1960s. The stuff we're talking about is very new, generationally speaking. It really goes back to the mid 20th century, to the point where we have some of the lowest marriage rates around, and Black men actually started, you know, really what Obsidian calls voting with their feet very early on, because it's right when you get to change in family court policy that starts to tilt overwhelmingly in women's favor, men started to see less and less incentive to marry. And when you factor that in with chronic unemployment and just the difficulties Black men faced, I mean, look, you know, again, I mentioned Eddie Murphy talking about Johnny Carson in the early 90s. And Eddie Murphy Raw, and he's talking about how much money, you know, millions that Johnny lost in his divorce. That's one thing. What happens when you make $20,000 a year? You ever have to lose, you know? And I think I can't remember which comedian joked about it. Might have been Chris Rock, but he was telling the truth. He said, you know, what happens if you got to give half of $10? You're gonna be pissed off.
That's right.
You know what I mean? So if you're living off of $18,000 a year and you got to lose half of that, and that's child support, alimony, whatever else you want to name it. You talking about brothers figuring out. I mean, because we've been the canaries in the mine for quite a while. The white manosphere comes about really long after Black men have been voicing their issues and concerns in the Black community. We just didn't have a platform. But this manosphere developed when well-to-do middle-class white men started noticing after second and third divorces how much they're paying to child support and how much they're paying for alimony, and they started to get frustrated. But Black men have been talking about this for years. And so we're kind of the canaries in the mine for a lot of this. And I think what the Black community is dealing with could metastasize to something that America is dealing with, because a lot of this has to do with Western modernity anyway.
Right.
In terms of these new generational roles, I mean, the new gender roles where women get to have no constraints while men get to be held to the 1950s. So she could work full-time, part-time. She could adopt, she could have a baby, she could have an abortion. She could work, you know, 2 hours a week and then 3 hours next month. You know, she can do whatever she wants. She can cook and clean. She can do none of that. You still got to protect, provide, or else you're trifling. You know, you can be a stay-at-home husband and all of that, but really, how much respect is generally given to men in that position?
Right.
I mean, it's not to say you can't do it, but there's a social punishment for doing it. There's a certain social currency for participating in a manner where you meet the other gender's expectations, as far as it relates to men meeting women's expectations. So the push is still, for many men report this, is still that he protect and provide. If she makes 300,000, he's expected to make 4. And, you know, and she may get with him if he doesn't, but what's the respect level at? How's he treated? How's he perceived? Right. And so those are the kind of issues we deal with. But on her end, she can do whatever she wants. And so this is something even I've heard in my dating life. Your money is our money. My money
is my money.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
How, you know, and so when you're dealing with that kind of attitude coming out of a 17-year-old girl that doesn't even have any money yet, if that's what's been baked into her, that's how she's been socialized since birth within her family, and most particularly under the women in her family, it's not a hard stretch for a young man to run into a woman from a different culture or a different group altogether that has a very different approach. I mean, my next door neighbor is a brother who's in an interracial relationship with a Latina. I live in Central California. It's pretty normal out here. And he came over one day and we had a conversation, you know, and he was like, you know, I listened to your show. I get a lot of this. I listen to your show, but it's almost like a secret. You know, they damn near your show.
Yeah,
you know
yeah.
And he was like, yo, he said, at the time I was unemployed and I was living with my parents. He met his Latina wife. He said they went on, he had invited her on a date. Their date was to watch Netflix at his house, at his parents' house, right? She shows up with a home cooked meal, right? And then from there, she pursued him. She pursued him. And now he's working on his doctorate, if I'm not mistaken. And he's about to transfer out, you know, I think to another unit. I don't know where he's going. But my point is, she saw potential in him when nobody else would. And he talked at length about how many of the women from his own community wouldn't even have nothing to do with him. And all of a sudden, he's got this woman over here who saw him as valuable before he saw himself as such. Now, that used to be a common story in the Black community. I mean, in terms of, you know, to some extent, when I was growing up, you kind of hear that kind of thing. Now, so many men report being told that they have to meet these unrealistic, like even, and this, you know, I've seen this on Kevin several times. He'd ask women, what percentage of men make 6 figures? The 6 figures you require in a relationship. What percentage of them make that? And I've heard women say, oh, 60, 70%.
It's a bare minimum. Yeah.
Bare minimum. It's like you're talking about 9% of America, right? Like of America. You know what I mean? So, you know, when you get to the Black community and you're asking for men of the, and, you know, one of the things Kevin was a master at is really getting past the lip service and getting to the values. So she may not say, I want 6 figures, but when she starts describing the lifestyle she expects from a man, it's a 6-figure lifestyle that he's supposed to provide. Right. And so we hear these people now, especially after his death, saying all this, oh, Kevin was a materialist. None of this was, you know, none of the stuff he was talking about was humane. We need to get back to just loving each other. It's like, yeah, we can talk about that, but how does that work when she's been raised to think of a relationship as a multi-million-dollar entity, or, you know, where the lifestyle expectation, you know what I mean? It is to say, she may get into a relationship with you, and she may marry you and have children with you. But what happens when she looks at you as a failure in terms of meeting a standard that you may not even know about? Right. How does she begin to treat you after a couple of years when the honeymoon phase is over, you got a couple kids, and you're seeing this disdain in this woman that you thought everything was good with, but you never even knew that there was a standard you were being measured against, and the boxes that weren't being checked was being held against you. This is what Kevin was a master of, getting out in the very first conversation, because he would ask it in sly ways. You know, he wouldn't say how much money does a man need to have. He'd say, well, you know, what kind of school you want your kids to go to? You know, what city do you want to live in? Do you want to take international trips? You know what I mean? He'd ask these kind of questions, and you'd be like, well, yeah, I want this and I want that. And then when you get to the core of it, he done added all that shit up and said, you do know that takes this amount of money, especially where you live. And people would just be like, oh, well, okay, yeah, that's what I want. And he'd be like, okay, well, that means you're dealing with the top 3% of men. And he asked a question that the Black community has never really seen posed to it, most particularly the women, in decades. And that was, okay, what do those men want from you?
Do you qualify? Yes.
Do you qualify? Now you got all kinds of people, men and women, feminists across the board especially, who are offended at the idea about having to qualify, or a woman having to qualify. But ain't nobody had a problem with men having to qualify for women's interests over the last 4 or 5 decades. Nobody's had a problem with it. Nobody. You telling black boys who come out of poor environments, whose families have never earned more than $30,000 a year, you're telling them they need to be half millionaires, making $500,000 a year to be considered qualified to even be a dating option. You know, when I interviewed Kevin on my channel, he told me that in the 90s, and I was there in the 90s, I was younger than him, but I saw what he was talking about. He said, if you made 6 figures, that qualified you for an interview. Yeah. In the 80s, we were told we had to make 6 figures to be, you know, for women to want us. But then he qualified that. He said, no, by the time you got to the 90s, 6 figures got your foot in the door for an interview. He said, and you'd go to dinner and she would talk to you like she was interviewing you for a job. And he was so right. He put so many of my experiences, even in the 90s, into context. I was like, you know, I never understood it that way. That was what it was. But, you know, but that's the kind of framework you're dealing with. And the funny part is, when you look at her family background, she comes from the same poverty that you come from. Black folk don't have we got wealth. We don't come from wealth. That's not our dynamic. But yet and still, you have this strange entitlement in place where, you know, and I've seen this, man, women working at liquor stores going to community college for the first time at, you know, at their late 20s with 3 kids, demanding 6-figure men with elite degrees who can somehow be a combination of Barack Obama and Tupac. Ridiculous.
Yeah.
You know? So, you know, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, to segue into the kind of the core of this conversation. Some of and you've mentioned it. Some of men's experiences with Black women originate from their experiences with their mothers, their grandmothers. A lot of times, women's rebuttal is "Who hurt you?" Right. And it's kind of common knowledge that her trauma comes from her father, whether he was absent or abusive or whatever the case may be. But it's kind of dismissed that the boy's trauma might come from his mother. And I think part of that too, part of one of the consequences that's very seldom discussed is when we talk about simp culture, like these men who unnaturally glorify women and approach women with this reverence and this idea of their benevolence and everything. It comes from exactly. And you talked about it in your Bitchcraft video. Can you help frame that and how it leads to son husbands?
Okay, well, the Bitchcraft video came about because a colleague of mine, he's a professor at another university. He had a colleague who teaches there with him. And at first he was saying that, you know, she was fairly cool, but over the years she started to develop a very different temperament. And so when we got to talking about it, you know, she was delving into certain esoteric practices, everything from tarot cards to crystals and whatnot. And then that kind of went into this whole other area where she was a Black goddess, and, you know, and she had to have people come worshiping her. And so he was, you know, kind of commenting on her behavior in the workplace, because college campuses are an excellent place to recruit. You know, it's almost like if you wanted to build a cult, there's no better place than a college campus to do it, especially for professors. You know, like, for example, I'm not ashamed of any of the work I do, but I don't use my online stuff in my classes. We just deal with the straight data. I don't have a list of acolytes following me around. I'm not trying to build a cult. What I'm trying to do is give these young men the data to go make their own decisions. But you have some professors that actually try and acquire people to follow them in a very particular way. And he was noticing that with the young women at his campus. And I've seen this at other campuses. And so I started talking to him about, you know, the things she was doing without him telling me. I'm saying, so she's doing X, Y, and Z and blah, blah. And he was like, yes, how do you, he said, it's like, you know her. I said, this is a pattern, and it's not limited to one religious expression. I've seen it across many. I've seen Christian, I've seen Muslim, and I've seen Yoruba, you know, the Ifa, you know, practitioners. And the funny thing is, really what it is it's a practice that's really mixed with a healthy dose of feminism, right? So Kevin talked about this in 2020 when he was talking about Christian feminists. He was identifying what I call bitchcraft among Black Christian women who were taking their own feminist interpretations of Bible and Christian practice, even though there wasn't any kind of authority that they were measuring that against. They were just doing it themselves based on what they felt. And I noticed the same thing in other practices. So with Ifa, what I noticed is you had these women that would only identify the female Orishas. They would ignore all the male ones. And if you talk to any Babalawos, they tell you that's unthinkable. That's not how you do that. But again, it was the same kind of thing you saw with Christian feminists. It was this whole different thing. And it was really rooted around, a desire to be worshipped and pedestalized in a particular way, and the power of being able to exploit people, particularly men, who are willing to pay you that kind of reverence. And so then we got to dealing with the whole issue. I noticed as well that you don't even have to have a religious component for that to work. You have some people that are so fixated on their own superiority over their men that they don't even need to invoke religion to employ that kind of idea. And I think we see it all the time in social media and mainstream culture, where, again, going back to that city girls kind of dynamic, bolstered by social media, the worshiping of, the feminine ideal can be exploited. And many men are exploited on a regular basis on that in terms of those ideas. So that's where Bitchcraft kind of came from as a critique. And you asked another you were talking about son husbands.
Yeah, son husbands.
Yeah. So part of this, and again, that this whole thing goes back a few decades as well, because I noticed the beginnings of it in the 80s. The superiority complex of some Black women really kind of starting in the 80s. Just that notion of having a checklist that men needed to meet, right? Six figures, six pack, 6'2". You need to be able to, have his own car, his own house, blah, 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 blah. That list I saw rise in the 80s, right? But there was no comparable list that men were exposing women to. I mean, to this day, when I ask my students, how many men have been told that they have to meet a checklist of expectations from women? I've never had a man not raise his hand, even if he's 17 and in his first year of college. On the reverse end, when I ask my young ladies, how many of you have had a man give you a checklist of expectations that you need to meet? I've yet to have one young lady raise her hand to say what that checklist was.
Yeah.
Not once. So this is the dynamic, right? So this is where this kind of entitlement begins, and it's reached a crescendo in this kind of goddess worship culture that we're seeing, right? Where you have women who are willing to exploit that. One of the figures that did that to the greatest degree is Jada Pinkett Smith. With August, what was his name? Alsina?
Yeah, August Alsina, yeah.
Yeah, I remember when this whole thing started, she was talking about her approach to him was supposed to help him heal, right? But that's like if I'm a psychologist and I'm helping you heal, but then I'm having sex with you on the side, that's not healing. That's me exploiting your vulnerability. And that's kind of what she was doing. So, this whole goddess worship culture kind of, overshadows exploitation in a particular way. But when you get to the son husband, what you had some women doing, and this is, been pretty consistent in the Black community, where you have, especially with the rise of single motherhood, right? So my generation, Gen X, we were the first generation where we were mostly single parent raised. And what you had was women who, were frustrated at men, frustrated at relationship, frustrated at not being able to find men who would be willing to play that role that they had pre-designed for him. And so they decided to kind of make their sons that. And currently what we're looking at in 2022 is those women are now senior citizens, and they have grown sons who are working out in the world, and daughters for that matter. And they're looking, and again, Kevin pointed this out, they're looking for these younger men and women to be their retirement policy, right? So they didn't get married. They decided to turn their especially their sons into their son husbands. Sometimes it does involve sex, I'm sad to say. Sometimes it doesn't. Most of the time, I would say it doesn't. But the expectations of him are still very husband-like. Yeah. The role that he's supposed to play. I talk about a concept I call male relationship emotional labor. The emotional labor that he's supposed to perform for her is usually emotional labor that husbands provide for wives.
Yes.
Boyfriends provide for to girlfriends. But this is something she's actually conditioned him to do for her. I've talked to women who married husbands who were son husbands and who prioritized his mother over her. This is the only time I really get women acknowledging son husbands and what in the role women play is when they've had to compete with a man's mother.
Mother, right.
And when that man chooses his mother over her, she got all kind of knowledge about son husbands at that point, right? But it really has to do with having young men especially, but it can be daughters too, playing a role that's really typically, the role of a husband. And it's just gotten to a point now where it now even includes a retirement policy, which is something I didn't expect to see in the 80s and 90s, but that's where it's gotten to. So now you have these son husbands who are trying to have families, trying to be out in the world, but they have an unnatural connection to their mothers. And a lot of that is rooted in that culture of the 80s of independence. I don't need a man, these kind of things. And the funny part is I can talk to men. I can talk to men who hate what I have to say, diehard feminists. And they're still familiar with niggas ain't shit. They're still familiar with I don't need a man. They heard these refrains and they didn't need to hear it on a television show. They didn't need to hear it on a YouTube show. They heard it from women talking to them. This was widespread in the culture and it still is. You know what I mean? And so that son husband culture is deep because here you have a controllable resource that is tied to you. I mean, even at birth, his very life depends on you as a woman, right? You know, young men learn very early. My well-being is really defined by her mood. How I eat is tied to her, how she feels in a given moment. Boys learn this growing up very early, even before they can craft words, that appeasing mommy comes with sustainability and maybe even happiness at a childlike age. So by the time he's 30 and 40, if he hasn't reflected on these things and had some therapy, he doesn't know anything else but meeting her desires and, and needs. And I'm not talking sexually, but like I said, that does happen. But one of the things you and I also talked about was what I call husband sons.
Husband sons. That was my next question.
Yeah. There's a video I'm sure you saw. I did a show on it, but a lot of people have been passing it around the internet. And it's a stepfather who's frustrated that his 29-year-old, or I guess his lady's son refuses to move out, refuses to, contribute to chores, refuses to contribute to the household. And he's trying to tell this young man, look, you got to go. You got to, go out into the world and live on your own. And the woman who's holding the camera recording all of this is saying, oh, you going to go before he does.
Ooh.
And he says, yo, I'm paying the bills in here. And she said, and you're going to keep paying the bills, but you're going to go before he does. Right. But the level of arrogance and entitlement in her voice, both of them are yelling at him at a certain point. Now, I got my critiques of him, even though I've seen many of these men who've been socialized since birth to serve women. But that's definitely one of the values of connecting with other like-minded men to develop a sense of confidence so you can actually recognize when a situation is worthy of walking away from.
Right.
But that said, one of the things, and I mistitled my video. I really should. I called it Son Husbands versus Stepfathers. I should have called it Son Husbands versus Husband Sons. Husband sons are grown men that have no biological connections to a woman at all. But he's in a station in life on one level or another where he's beneath the woman he's with. And she uses him in an exploitive manner, but she controls him. Both dynamics, son husbands and husband sons, are about control. It's about women in a dominant position who are able to emotionally control the men they're with. Son husbands are their biological offspring. Husband sons are men that they go find in the world who are willing to serve. And much of the time, they're men at a lower social level, right? So one of the best examples I could give is I ran into a gentleman, a couple of years ago who I'd known for a while, and he pulled me to the side and he said, man, I want to understand something. He said, my wife is a six-figure earner. And her girlfriends are six-figure earners, and they come over to the house to complain all the time, sipping wine, complaining about their husbands. Well, their husbands are ex-cons who were virtually homeless when they got together, right? Now they're married, they have kids with these men, and those men need to get an allowance from her just to go hang out at the bar and get a drink with him. And he's like, why are these high-level women dating these men and yet have so much contempt for them at the same time? And I was like, well, they're controllable. You're not going to go get, I'm not, I don't know what name you go by, but we're not gonna go get. We need to talk.
Alan, yeah, I just go by my name.
I don't,
Some people I understand.
A lot of brothers. I don't
understand. I understand.
But
just me.
A woman in that position who wants somebody that she can control can't go get an Alan and just say, do what I tell you to do. Right. But if you can go get a man that's got a record, that doesn't have a place to live, that doesn't have a job, that doesn't have any framework, and he doesn't have much ambition, if you can go get him and you can get married, you can have a couple kids, there's a control factor there because you know, and I used to tell men this, you're one argument away from a park bench.
Right.
You know what I mean? That's a level of power in a relationship that a lot of women enjoy, but nobody talks about. See, we call it financial abuse when men do it to women, when men have financial control, but technically the concept applies to women in positions of authority in a relationship too. We just don't talk about it that way. But in the Black community, you will have white collar, 6-figure earning women who will go out and look for men that they can control, men that they know at the end of the day can't go anywhere.
Yeah.
If she tells him what to do, he can't oppose her, but that's what I call a husband son. So in either dynamic, it's about control, but it's control from two different ends. And in that video I was referring to, you had a woman that had both. She had a son husband and a husband.
Wow.
Yeah. And if you see it from that vantage point, it's actually you can see the exploitation in it. But if you don't have it, you won't see it.
That's so interesting because oftentimes in this space we talk about why do women keep picking certain types of men? Why do the Pookies and the Ray Rays get all the play? And I don't think enough men actually consider the fact that it's easier to manipulate a Pookie or a Ray Ray or a they call them hobosexuals. Right. It's easier. So like to your point, when we see these lawyers and these women who are doing great things be with street guys and guys who have no car, no place to stay, that really makes a lot of wow.
Well, there's I mean, it's nuanced, right? Because street brothers have always been associated with masculinity. Right. More masculine than the cat that went to school and got a degree and so on and so forth. So and there is a virility that I think these women have stereotyped, and it's tied to hip hop, right? So if he's and I've seen this with drug dealers and I've seen it with, some of the guys we're talking about. If they can be associated with this quote unquote street masculinity, it's considered more virile, it's considered more masculine on one end, but she also controls that man and that masculinity. Right. Almost like she has him on a leash, and she can unleash it. We do talk about on my channel proxy violence, and there have been a number of cases I've shown over the years where a woman will sick a man on you. I mean, I think it's been popularized with the Will Smith, Chris Rock.
Like a pit bull, like her own personal pit bull that she can have sex with. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. If you can emotionally control somebody, it's a wrap. It's a wrap. You can really do that. I mean, I've seen women in their 50s. Hell, I was one of the dudes I dated when I was 20. I was dating women in their 40s and 50s, and at the end of the day, I was just curious. What you'll find, what you'll find as a young man is you'll have great conversations you can't have with women your age. You're able to go do things, and all these things are great. You have a great, but after a while, the age, the experience in life, those things begin to bear out. And if you don't really get your bearings, you can find yourself as a husband, son in one of these dynamics where you're emotionally controlled by someone older than you, with more life experience. You can be emotionally manipulated in ways you don't even have a language for yet. You know what I mean? And some women seek that out in men, but they'll sick a man on you like a pit bull. I mean, even in terms of spousal homicide, when you look at the data around that, when women want their husbands killed, poor women, and this is going back to Warren Farrell's book, Myth of Male Power in the 1980s, poor women use sex to often manipulate younger men into killing their husbands. Wealthier women use money. They pay for assassins. But, so when you're dealing with poor women who don't have those resources, they use sex to manipulate. But that's still emotional manipulation, right? That's still turning a man into a weapon, a missile, if you will, and firing it at someone else. That's a lot of what we see. So in terms of the street brothers we're talking about, there isn't a sexual attraction to this perceived virility, the stereotyped Black male, that's kind of associated with criminality, drug dealing, and and gangster, violence and so on and so forth. There is that sexual component is there. But the other component that none of us talk about is that she's more in an established position to emotionally manipulate someone who's dependent on her than someone who is self-reliant. You know what I mean? You don't have to be even 60. If you make $60,000 a year, you got your own apartment, you got your own car. It may not be the newest car in the world, but you're happy. You got your shit together. You're not going to be as easily manipulatable, in most circumstances. You're not going to run into a woman and get her pregnant after the first sexual encounter because you have something to lose. It's a very different dynamic. But You can find someone who's vulnerable, someone who doesn't care, someone who can easily be led around or told what to do or pressured into doing what you want him to do, and doesn't even have the wherewithal to challenge it, even when it's against his interest to follow you. There are women that seek those men out, and we don't talk about it.
So I don't know. Are you familiar with the Blueface situation with his mom, and how his mom and his sister would beat up some of his girlfriends? And I mean, we know like Mama D and that queen esque, like what are your thoughts on that?
Oh,
How do we need to understand that?
It's that very thing. It's a mixture of things. So that mother, Blueface's mother, he's in that respect, he's a son husband, but he's also been in the streets. He's also a hip hop artist. So, there's that virility that she has on a leash in terms of that. He's able to bring her resources at her whim, and buy things. I think he's managed to tell her no a couple times, which she didn't like, and she publicly chastised him for it. Which is something you generally do when you think you have enough emotional control over someone to get what you want out of them, even if it's your son. But this whole notion of fighting and beating up your son's girlfriends and that kind of mess, or getting your sister to do it, there's so much dysfunction and emotional manipulation going on. And it's coming from that queen mother position. And I said earlier, girls can get tied into this too. Her daughter is on a leash as much as her son. I would argue she's emotionally manipulated both of them to work in her interest. They are her retirement plan. And I think she does have a husband or a boyfriend or something of that nature, but there was nothing substantive there when I did hear about their relationship. So the way it struck me was that he was a disposable resource. He was great for sex. He was great for maybe sperm if she was still in that stage of wanting another child when they first got together, or whatever it is. There's a role that men are allowed to play with women like that, but it's very controlled, and it's very much on her terms. What happens, when it happens, how it happens is all on her. And he plays a role in, just kind of meeting her expectations when he's called to do it. So I think between her man and her son and her daughter, you're talking about that very queen mother bitchcraft we're talking about, where manipulation, that's why I was saying it doesn't even have to be religiously based. It can strictly be on the basis of her desire to manipulate others for her own well-being. And, so when I was first thinking about the topic, I was noticing it with people who were abusing religion to control others. But I noticed you can abuse sexuality. You can abuse particularly a man's willingness to try and make women happy. I mean, we're socialized around that. Right. Our social worth as men has often been tied to how beautiful the woman is that we're with, and whether or not we've successfully made her happy, right? And that's supposed to clarify what our value is as men. If your woman is walking around wearing the newest stuff and she's got a smile on her face, that's supposed to say something about you. And that's the way we've been taught that our manhood was supposed to roll, because it worked in women's interest to do so. But now you have men that are questioning, well, what if my manhood isn't defined by how well you're dressed?
Well, yeah, right.
What if my manhood is not tied to your happiness at all? I mean, you have this new philosophical movement that's Eastern based that argues that that happiness is everybody's own responsibility to themselves. I can't make you happy. I can give you $1 million. It doesn't make you happy. You know what I mean? It may make you may be titillated for a moment. But how many rich people do we see commit suicide? You know what I mean? Right. So the whole idea is nothing outside of you can make you happy. You're responsible for making yourself happy. And as more and more men start to gravitate to that philosophy and question my gender, my role as a man, how much of it has to be tied to these things that are impossible, right? And so as men are questioning that, they're starting to set themselves free of these social expectations. And I think in many ways it's scaring and frustrating a lot of women who based their whole kind of life philosophy around manipulating others in their own interest.
So for the women, for the young women who may watch this, and maybe they come to a realization that, okay, shit, I'm heading in that direction, right? I may be conscious of it, I may be unconscious of it, but I'm heading in that direction. How do they get off that train?
Well, taking responsibility for your own happiness, for one, can be liberatory for both people in a relationship. I mean, the ideal kind of relationship is when you have two people that are together, not necessarily to make each other happy, but to share the happiness that they've created in their own lives with each other. Right. Therefore, so it's not my job to buy you the latest Birkin bag to make you happy. I may buy you the bag, I may not. That has nothing to do with your happiness. It has nothing to do with mine. If I do something for you, it's because I want to. You know what I mean? If I play a certain role in your life, and that should be something you establish early on when you're dating someone. This is the kind of relationship I'm looking for. I'm a traditional man. I want to take care of all of the provisioning and whatever, but in response, I want a certain modicum of respect. I want a certain interaction with a woman. You define those things early on, but gender roles in a relationship are just roles. They're not the basis of happiness. So if you have two people that understand that basic precept, it's not up to this person or any other person outside of myself to keep a smile on my face. That's my job. If I can find my own contentment, my own happiness, then I'm looking for someone to share it with. And if we can share that with each other, we can be cool. Anyway, so in terms of your question about, whether a woman pulling herself off that track, that would be one of the major steps. Like, I'm looking for someone to share my happiness with, and the gender roles that we're willing to play in a relationship, that depends on what our philosophies are. And if we know we have two competing philosophies on that first date, then it's probably best we don't go any further, because I know what I want. A woman may want a man who provides for her. She may want someone that she provides for. I don't judge what you want, but are you realistic about how that works? And can you articulate that to someone so that you don't have these missed messages and you're battling back and forth over that? So coming into it with an understanding that your happiness is your responsibility, which again is very liberating for both people if you really think about it. But then being clear about, these are the gender role, practices that I want to engage in. And there are men like that too. Some men actually look for women that are, we would call sugar mamas. Hey, as my cousin used to say, you like it, I love it. I ain't mad. Right. But be clear about what it is. You know what I mean? And I don't believe in chastising men who want to actually play traditional roles. And I think we've gotten to that point, especially in the left culture. We've gotten to that point where, men wanting to play traditional roles is considered inherently bad. But the strange part about it is you still got a lot of women, and Kevin revealed this, that want to be in those traditional dynamics. They just want to add that.
They want the benefits of it, none of the responsibility. Yeah.
They want the benefits, but in doing so, they want to add that feminism that we talked about with the Christian feminists. They want to add that twist. So you protect and you provide, but I'm not going to cook and clean or whatever else. And I'm not saying that a woman's role is limited to cooking and cleaning. It was more about the domesticity, the relationship angle, the hearth and home angle. Whatever two people negotiate is part of what that is. But when you come into the dynamic saying, I want traditionalism from you, but I'm going to give you nothing. You may get
because I am the table. Yeah.
That bullshit. It doesn't work. Yeah. And then they start saying, well, this ain't the 1950s. Well, you want it to be the 1950s for me. For you.
Yeah. Right.
You want me to play the 1950s role, but people don't often understand even that idea of the traditional 1950s relationship. As problematic as we can say it was always based on an exchange of resources. Protect and provide for hearth and home. The relationship, the management of the kids, he manages the outside world. There was an exchange of resources. That was what the basis of it is. So if you're going to start changing the roles, that's fine, but you got to still acknowledge the exchange. And that's what women aren't doing. They want to change the roles to suit their interests, like you were saying. They want to cherry pick which aspects of patriarchy, because that's what it is, which aspects of patriarchy they like, but they don't offer an exchange other than occasional sex. And many use sex as an attempt to control someone as well. You know what I mean? Sex is something you dole out when he's been a good boy. I mean, I've even heard younger women, laughing and applauding this when they were taught this from their grandmothers and their aunties. I remember one woman told me, yeah, my auntie, she would only give her husband some when he did the lawn and whatever else. I'm like, this mess is ridiculous. But
it's ridiculous, yeah.
The exchange of resources is what a lot of people want to sidestep. So they just want more and more without any exchange. And men have been socialized to give in terms of their part of the exchange. We come into relationships understanding that provisioning is something we're going to be measured against, whether we do it well or not. We do it poorly, we know we're going to be judged for that. If we do it well, we know that that's going to be accepted. But women haven't had to articulate what they give in the exchange. Yeah. Many of us have gotten used to not being able to ask for anything. When you're actually unhappy in a relationship because it's one-sided, we don't even have the language to articulate why we're frustrated. So a lot of men find that extra 20%, as they say, that they're not getting in their relationship somewhere else.
Right. But I mean, a lot of times women will say that they're doing the emotional labor, without being able to quantify it.
Without being able to quantify it. But part of the reason you can get away with that is because if male emotional labor has never been defined, then any emotional labor you point to, because feminists have talked about emotional labor for decades, so women can claim that, and if there's no language for what men do, we don't even argue the point.
Right.
Kind of like some years ago when we used to talk about intimate partner violence, even rape within relationships, there were documentaries that I watched all the way through graduate school that would say things like 99% of rapes occur from men to women. Right? But part of the reason for that is that it wasn't until 2012 that the FBI redefined rape to actually account for scores of cases that they had on the books that they didn't know how to classify. And those cases were men who were sexually violated by women. But the definition of rape all the way up to 2012 was, it was only about, the carnal knowledge of a woman, against her will kind of thing. So if the definition of rape is that it only happens to women, then of course you can say 99% of rapes are committed by men, because that's the definition. But once the definition began to include made to penetrate, a number of different factors that included men, now all of a sudden you started to see the rates of men's violation rise. And it wasn't because it was happening more, it was because we ignored it. Since the advent of the concept of rape on legal terms. So this is the kind of framework we're falling into, where now men have to be included in the dynamic, and we're finding it's changing the dynamic. Even abuse, intimate partner violence, we're finding the rates in the Black community are bidirectional. They're virtually even. Violence from men to women and women to men. And ironically enough, LGBT relationships, most particularly amongst lesbians, have the highest rates of abuse. So when we look at the data, all the things that we believe to be true are thrown into question, and we haven't accounted for that yet. So, this whole movement of men that are starting to come forward and articulate themselves, they're tipping the table about what's been considered conventionally true for decades. And it's frustrating a lot of people who've been raised to operate by a set of standards that no longer really exist.
Wow. So one of my biggest critiques of men, especially in the work that I'm doing, is that it becomes incredibly hard to continue to critique women when you still have a group of men, a delegation of men still committed to validating women, still committed to validating them sexually, with attention, with money, the whole nine. Like even, some of the worst interview exchanges that I've had on my channel, she still gets 200 followers. She still gets DM'd and solicitations and the whole nine. How do we, as men who know better, is there any way we can mitigate this thing and actually get through to the women?
Well, I would say this, because my audience is, I'm mainly talking to men. I do have women that come through my channel, but they're not my target audience. So, that it's a different dynamic. But so when I talk to the men, one of the first things I say is, we have to get away from this thing where we're so afraid to speak, we're worried about losing out on women. That's the first thing. Because I used to have men, I used to have men reach out to me and say, "Oh man, I love what you're saying, but I could never do that."
Can't say it out loud, right?
Again, and I'm like, look, man, at the end of the day, what I find is, Patrice O'Neal used to say it, my favorite comedian.
It's a fact. You ain't gonna lose them. No, they'll still be there. Yep.
Yeah, he said women are different than us, man. They like us for different reasons. He's like, he was probably one of the most. I heard him when he passed, one of the ways somebody who wrote his kind of, not his formal obituary, but one of the articles about him, they said he was like a feminist misogynist.
Yeah.
He advocated for women while tearing them down. But at the end of the day, he would say they like us for different reasons. So, the more unapologetically yourself you are, even if you're saying things that you think women will hate, you'd be surprised who's in your DMs. You know what I mean? And I can confirm that. You can be overweight, you can be unattractive. If you got charisma and you got a strength of character to yourself, you'd be surprised who's knocking on your door. And I mean that literally. You might get some trench coats visits, if you know what that is. In the summer in a trench coat and with nothing on underneath it, knocking on your door. You'd be surprised. So just be yourself, be unapologetic. And I think men need to move to that point where their concern is not appeasing women, as a way to get women's affections. But that's how we've been socialized. I mean,
Right.
again, growing up in the 80s, we grew up off of all of those, Babyface, New Edition, all those songs, pay her rent, kiss her ass. We grew up on that, and we learned a healthy dose of, if you don't make her happy, you will be punished.
Happy wife, happy life. Yeah.
Yeah. And even without a wife.
Yeah, right.
We still had the same kind of dynamic in place. And this is the first time where you see men saying, you know what? I'm not making that my first priority anymore. I got to say what I got to say. You know what I mean? I'm a father of a son. I'm a widower and a father of a son. I can't be up here chasing women and kissing behinds when I got to teach him how to navigate this world. My first priority has to be what I found to be true based on empirical, measurable data, and give that to him so he has a better chance navigating this world than I had. That's my job.
So, I'm really interested in your answer to this question. I have a daughter, right? My daughter's 1. I'm very concerned about, because I can't control the world, right? I can only control how I teach her and the whole 9. So like, she still has to go out into the world in schools, and she still dialogues with this modern feminist, neo-feminist context. What can I do as a concerned father to get her off that potential train?
Well, I'll tell you this much. The women that I find tend to be those who are the easiest to talk to, those who are more apt to listen are 2 types, and often those 2 types overlap. If she has sons, that's a huge deal.
Yeah.
If she has a tie in her nest, in her house, of someone that, a black man that she's got, even a black boy, that she's got to, prepare him for the world, she's more apt to listen to these discussions in earnest because she loves him. Some of the biggest problems you'll have are like women who are mothers of daughters. They ain't got no men in their lives, no husbands, no boyfriends. That's when you're gonna deal with some hell. But if you got a mother of a son, you got a better chance that she's more willing to negotiate and talk and dialogue because of her love for this child. The second group are women that had active and loving fathers. And if you run into one that had an active and loving father and she has a son, yeah, you might want to sit down and talk to her, right? But so active and loving fathers plays a critical role in this.
That's
because
true, man.
Part of the feminist dynamic is predicated on misandry, on the contempt for men.
Yeah.
But you'll find when women have had positive role models in men from birth, it's not as easy for them to take in this narrative that men ain't shit, black men in particular, if the living example of a loving man has been raising her from day one, has been to every game, has been there to put a Band-Aid on every boo-boo, kissed her, when they've had that kind of love, they don't take to these feminist philosophies the same way. Even if they are advocates for female ascendance or whatever, they still have a care for men that operates differently. And she'll engage men more often than not on different terms because you've been the model, right? So, I would say with what I've seen from your show, you're primed to raise a daughter that's going to have an appreciation for masculinity, that's going to have an understanding of what the positives of a man can be and what the measuring stick of the kind of man she wants to be with is. Not this artificial measuring stick of how much he needs to make, but the quality character of a man. She's going to pick that up from you. And it's particularly important because we don't live in a culture that has an appreciation for masculinity.
Right.
This is why you see so many men who are talking about SYSBM. If you look closely, they're identifying women not only in other cultures, but in cultures that have an embedded appreciation for men.
Oh, man.
Look at the countries that these men are talking
That's
about.
true.
Brazil, the DR. They're going to countries, especially in South America, but even in Africa. They're going for places where there's a love and appreciation for men because they don't get that here. Even on default, even if you deal with one of the quote unquote good ones, if you listen long enough, you'll hear the misandry come out because it's so baked into the culture. She doesn't know what it is. It's just what she's learned. You know what I mean? And a lot of men are so sensitive to it at this point because we've had so much of it that even the smallest amount of misandry and brothers are out. But they're going to places where you don't have the same relationship to misandry because the culture doesn't really allow for that. And that's what you're seeing.
And I'm so happy you put it that way because I'm even noticing it with my sisters. And the crazy thing about my sisters is my dad is in our life. he's not the most visible figure in our
Mm-hmm.
life. And I never considered that could have played a part in their misandry and their contempt for, like, even the way that they talk to me, even though I'm the oldest. Like it's who do you think you are? There is that who do you think you are energy still.
What people don't often understand that even in the West, the definitions of manhood and fatherhood have changed so fast. If you go back, now I'm sure you saw Denzel Washington's Fences, right?
Yes.
With Viola Davis, right? The whole film in many respects was dealing with this transitory period. So when you looked at Denzel, when his character Troy would talk about his father and himself, he would say, look, I bring home the check every week. I bring home the groceries. She spends the money on the bills. The social expectations of men all the way up through the 60s and even through part of the 70s was about you had to provide. That's your job. You weren't expected to be emotionally present. That wasn't something that hit the culture until like the 1980s. And when I say hit the culture, it became a social expectation, but nobody taught men how to do it. It was expected of you. You needed to be this, I don't know, all in the family, my two dads' father that was emotionally present. But, that wasn't what men were taught. We were taught, your job was to provide, and that made you a good man. The better your kids were able to eat, the more dependable they were, dependably they could depend on house and home and so on and so forth. That was the measure. So all of a sudden you start getting these new expectations. And from the 80s to now, the expectations of emotional presence have only morphed in ways that we've never seen before. I mean, if you take the preeminent ideal father from the mid 1980s that was learning about this emotional presence idea, the standards we have now are unfathomable even to that guy. You know what I mean? Like your son tells you at 4 he wants to be a girl. Well, what are you supposed to do now? Well, according to the culture, you're supposed to treat him like a girl. And if he wants to have surgery, you're supposed to give it to him. This is the rhetoric in certain parts of the country, right?
Yeah.
The social expectation of you as a father listening to a child. That didn't, these are things that are new. And people don't realize that the changing definition of father has only been in the last number of decades. So that whole shift in and of itself has put a new standard on fatherhood and manhood that is unprecedented. And we measure men's value against how well they meet this constantly changing idea that has gone through radical transformations since the 1960s. But the twist is the definition of motherhood has often been within the realm of what women wanted it to change into. It was very much tied to their independence, their political ascendancy, their access to new types of employment in the market. They've had much more control over the new definitions of motherhood and womanhood than men have had over fatherhood and manhood. And so now men are trying to reclaim some of that control, and it is scaring the shit out of a lot of people.
Right.
When men are willing to walk away from sex, I mean, I've never heard this many men talking about monkhood and the values of monkhood. I'd never even heard that 10 years ago. You got men from 15 to 60 talking about the value of monkhood. No fap.
No
right?
fap. Yeah.
Celibacy.
Yeah.
What?
Holding on to your energy. Yeah.
Yeah. And you have some women that have predicated their life plans on being able to sexually manipulate men into serving their interests. And now you got men talking about, oh man, I haven't had sex in a year. And I mean, I feel good. I mean, my life is peaceful. I don't have any drama. When I check my bank account, it's exactly what it was yesterday. I mean, you have men extolling the virtues of monkhood. Do you know how frustrating a cultural context has to be for men to start extolling the value of monkhood? You know how bad relationships have to get for that to be. And that's what it is. But the only narrative we've heard over the last 40 years about who suffers in relationships has been women. And that's mainly because men haven't had a platform. So you have women that legitimately think they are the only ones with issues, and men are sitting here living well that just are too stupid to learn that these women are having problems. They do not fathom in the slightest that men actually have a legitimate problem with them. It hasn't even crossed many of their minds. I just covered an article earlier today about a woman frustrated over her dating options and what she doesn't have. She's a theologian. She writes this article talking about how frustrated she is that she's never actually had a real relationship. At no place in the article does she even reflect on what men may want. or what she needs to do to get men. Her
Right,
whole
right.
article, which is celebrated in many circles by Black women, her whole article is based on what these men are not doing well enough for her.
Yep. They're not enough options. They're not doing this enough. They're not this enough. Yeah.
Absolutely. But again, men are taught. I'm not saying men are inherently better because they just know shit that women don't know. We have had to learn certain things.
Yeah.
We had to learn that if you want, and I said this earlier today in my show. I said, look, even in 4th grade, when I decided I didn't know, I didn't have the word girlfriend yet, but I wanted girls in my life in some kind of way.
Right.
Even then, I had to change. I had to adapt to what they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? In 4th grade, I remember a girl said, well, you dress like a bum and you need to bathe. Now I'm in 4th grade. The only thing I care about is playing at recess. That's it. We ran everywhere we went to. We wrestled, we played soccer, football, basketball, you name it, baseball, dodgeball. That was all we cared about. So the moment I got interested in girls, now all of a sudden my clothes got to match and I got to smell better.
Right.
Okay? But again, it hits you with a crossroad. Either I do this and start entertaining girls, or I say fuck it and I keep playing with my boys, and that's it. None of my boys ever complained about my clothes,
right,
or how I smelled, because we all stunk. We were 4th
grade, right?
And we bathed every day, and we still stunk because we didn't care. We played, But my point is, we learned even at a young age, if you wanted to be around girls, you had to adapt to their interests on one level or another. Girls and women don't really conceptualize it that way. They think, and this has been how they've been socialized, as long as they control the gateway to sex, that's all. That's it. Yeah. So she doesn't have to achieve; she just is. The moment that she reaches maturity and she can reproduce, she just is. And boys and men are supposed to cater to her if they want to be in her space. That's what women have learned. And now you have an unprecedented situation where men are saying, "Nah, it's not worth it. Not worth it." I'll chill on that, and I'll actually wait for some. I mean, Kevin used to say it all the time: men will go down in beauty to go up in cooperation.
Right.
That's heavy when you think about that. That's heavy.
Yeah. We'll settle. Settle. And that's actually been part of my conversation with women now. I've been using the basketball analogy, saying, if you can't dunk, you should develop a jump shot. You should develop your handling. You should develop your understanding of the playbook, because women's critique or rebuttal often is that I see rich men with average women all the time. And I tell them, you see them with average looking women, but those women are not average. Those women are not average. Those women are Tom Brady's.
That's real talk. Yeah, that's real talk. I mean, look, I'm talking about. Look, okay, I've told this story several times, but when my wife passed, it was 2009, and I looked around. She had sickle cell, so I looked around and I noticed that about 29 of my male friends and associates, I'm very, very particular who I call a friend, but out of 29 friends and associates, Black males, all of whom had a college degree, right? Only one of them was with an African-American woman. Only one of them was with a white woman. 2 of them had gone monk, but we didn't have that term then. It was practically the best thing for them. They were just tired. All of the rest had found Black women from other cultures and other countries. All of them, right? So it was something like 25 of them. And I was pissed. I was like, wait a minute, because I knew their wives and stuff, but I never paid attention to it until all of a sudden I was single again. I said, where the hell y'all get all these other women from? And when I asked them about it, I said, did y'all plan this? They were like, no, it just happened organically. In other words, they went where they were treated best. That was it. They went where they were treated best, and that's just kind of how it went. It wasn't planned. There was no hashtag SYSBM. There was none of that. They just went where they were treated well, came back with women from those cultures, and those women were, as you say, they were dime pieces, and it wasn't about how they looked, because some were absolutely gorgeous and some were far from it. I got my boys. I ain't gonna talk about it, but I'm saying, but none of that was the priority for them. They were concerned with peace, right? And yet I got other boys that are still trying to uphold a very particular idea, that are arguing with their girlfriends over getting them a glass of water. And I really wish that wasn't a true situation. I'm not making that up. They are arguing with girlfriends over asking for a glass of water. So a lot of these men got tired of it. They got tired of it. And so I'm not an advocate of one group of women is better. I don't go around saying, oh, you need to date white women, you need to date Latinos. Right. I don't say any of that. To me, I'm just at a place in my life where, one, I don't judge. And most particularly, I don't judge black men who found their happiness wherever the hell they found it from. I don't care if it's a sister with an afro from Philly or if it's the whitest, Jan Brady woman you didn't find. I don't care. To me, I just want men to prioritize happiness and peace because I've never seen it happen in my lifetime until now on any wide level. So that's my thing. I prioritize that men seek that out and prioritize their own well-being. I'm fucking tired of brothers dying in their 50s and 60s due to stress. And it's much stress in their homes as it is fighting the world.
Man.
Standards of society. I'm tired of seeing these brothers having heart attacks and whatnot because they cannot find peace. And then to shame them into being in dysfunctional relationships with women who see themselves as better than and see their men as nothing but tools. I got real problems with that when I start reading obituaries or seeing how these men are actually treated or hearing stories from family members about how they're treated by the women they've been with for decades sometimes. I'm sick of it. So I'm at a point where I'm look, just find your peace wherever you can find it, damn it. Because it's time. It's absolutely time. So, wherever they got to go, hey. And if the African-American community can get on its feet and men can find viable, peaceful, loving options within the community, I am all for it. All for it. But if that's not where they find it, you got to compete. And if you're not willing to compete, then I guess you don't value men that much.
Whew. That's a mic drop right there. That I have no other questions. Is there something? First of all, I want to appreciate you. Thank you so much for your time for these jewels. Man, is there anything else you wanted to add as far as just to help kind of button up this subject, this thing that we have to deal with, that we have to wrestle with?
Well, I will say I'm about to get that brother Allen on my show, and
let's do it.
We're gonna find out what makes him tick, man. Because you as you put it, your ministry is important, and I think it's been very illuminating to see some of the outcomes of these conversations. It's similar to what we saw with Kevin. Different tone, different sensibility, but still having dialogues that bring things out. And I can appreciate that because that's not my role. I mean, I really don't engage women and try and get them to talk. My role is really about trying to develop this language and this critique that men have that we don't know how to develop. But I think both roles are important. And I want to get at what brought you into that space, how you kind of came about it. So we're going to do an interview next week where we get to find out what makes Alan tick and how he got to this point. And I think that's the necessary part of this discussion. What are the different angles that black men are coming at this problem? I don't care if they're walking away or if they're trying to make it work, because a lot of people don't realize Kevin was actually pro-black community.
Right. Right.
They don't know that.
And marriage, pro-marriage too. Yeah.
Now, whether or not we can argue about how possible or viable that idea is, but Kevin was actively trying to, get black people together again. And marriage is an important component in that dynamic. Now, I'm the first one to say that marriage should always be something men are skeptical of because of the policy treatment in family courts. When you've actually go sit in a family court and watch, if you can, watch how those things take place. Watch how judgments are levied. Watch how men are treated, on a policy level in terms of how those policies are implemented in courts. It is just heartbreaking to see the kind of consistent mistreatment of men, fathers, husbands in these dynamics. So I'm the first one to be critical of marriage in terms of that level of it. But I understand the value of marriages. I understand the statistics around kids that do better in society and in life because they grew up with two parents in the home, especially if those two were married and in a positive relationship, right? I do see the value of marriage. Look, there's a colleague of mine got into a motorcycle accident and he was married, right? But he was also seeing another woman. And the other woman knew he was married and didn't care. She said this is the best she'd ever been treated. She loved it. So she was happy to be the side piece. He got into a motorcycle accident and spent months in the hospital. That side woman couldn't even so much as call him. She couldn't go in the hospital. Damn. She couldn't visit him. She couldn't hear from him. He couldn't walk. And damn sure couldn't pick up his phone to call her from a hospital bed, especially while his wife was sitting there, right? So why do I bring that up? I'm saying marriage actually in a society, that marriage is, legally speaking, can play an important role. Had he died, who would have inherited what he had, his wealth, right? She would have got nothing. And these things can be important. I mean, when you're talking about marriage in a given society, there is a valued role that it plays in society in terms of policy, in terms of law, so on and so forth. So I understand the importance of it legally. I understand the importance of it in culture. I understand the importance of it in terms of how it benefits children. But I also understand that until the policies change, it's kind of a trap for many men. We can find ourselves in some real vulnerable space going into that unaware. I mean, right. Hell, even what do you call the oh goodness, I'm blanking on the contracts that you can have signed. Prenup. Thank you. Prenup. Even with the prenup, we're seeing prenups being overturned.
Yep.
You know what I mean? So it's
she signed it under distress.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. We're seeing all kinds of reasons. So, that said, Kevin was pushing for marriages. He wanted to see the community rise. And the funny part about it is, I won't call it funny. It wasn't. The sad part about it was you had women throwing parties at his death. And some men looked at that and said, that's interesting because he was a lot. One could argue he was the last chance.
He was putting y'all on game.
He was putting y'all on game. He was trying to say
these young dudes are leaving.
Yes.
The young guys do not care at all.
They don't care. They don't have that same sense of race loyalty. I was a child of a Panther. Our generations were the children of that 70s, 60s, 70s era. So we still had a certain idea about race loyalty. The younger ones, they don't have that same relationship. So Kevin was trying to say, look, if you want this community to work, you got to listen to men. For the first time in your life, you actually got to hear what they want and you got to deal with it. You may not want to meet each one, but you got to deal with it. That was the first time many women have even heard that. That was the first time many men even heard that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they were the first to celebrate when he was gone. And it's like, I don't know if you want to do that because there's a lot of guys who are just standing at the side. Well, first, it's a problem. They're looking at you like he might have been, many people's last chance at getting in a relationship with a black man. But the other thing some people are just doing is they're watching the celebrating and the dismissal and the disrespect of black men as filtered through Kevin. And they're saying, I talked about this when he passed. There were women were throwing social media parties and all kinds of shit. And I'm just going, okay. A lot of brothers watching in silence from the sidelines, like
y'all don't really love us.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Because I don't care if you're talking about bell hooks. I don't care if you're talking about Maya Angelou. I don't care. I mean, remember, bell hooks got up in, I think it was major newspapers talking about the Central Park Five actually did it. You know what I mean? Unfathomable. Yeah. When did you see black men throwing social media parties when she passed? Right. And when I asked individual women that, well, I knew a black guy and he posted that he couldn't stand her when she died. Word. But did you see New York Times articles celebrating her death? Did you see major platforms showing black men dancing in the streets at her death? You didn't see that. You didn't see that. And you're not going to see it with some of the most, what I would consider depraved feminists that had nothing but hatred for black men. You're still not going to see black men do that. You don't even see it in terms of interracial relationships. How many black men do you see throwing, burning images and around, the Williams, Serena who married a white man? Like, they don't even do that. Black men just kind of look at it and say, oh, okay.
It is what it is. Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean? But when you see a brother with it, to this day, he's torn apart in social media. So I'm just saying this one-way aggression, as Kevin called it, is well accepted in many circles. And so you have men that are fighting it and challenging it. But what I think people really need to be mindful of is the silent majority. The silent majority of men who are standing on the sides just watching. And they're voting with their feet. They're not going to argue with you. They're not going to have long debates. They're not going to go through yelling matches back and forth, pulling out papers and data and charts to try and make their points.
Yeah.
You know, I do that shit, and they share my videos with each other. Maybe the occasional woman that they're interested in, but beyond that, a lot of these guys are not doing that anymore. They're just like, okay, I'll go find my peace where I find it, or I won't. I'll make my own peace if that's what it is. Because women have, you know, kind of done that same thing with men for the longest. They've just kind of said, well, you know, I'm gonna sit here with my 6 figures and be well, and if he doesn't cater to me, whatever. And men have gotten to the same point where they're like, you know what? Okay.
And that's unfortunately that's been my experience too. Like I'm actually one of the ones willing to have a 2-hour dialogue with a woman and try to explain to her why she's having the outcomes that she's having, and it's still I'm the bad guy.
Oh yeah.
And sometimes I tell them I don't have to do this. Like I don't want to sleep with you. I gain nothing from this, but I care. But you're still acting like I don't.
Hey,
like
look, I'm not, and I don't mean this in any kind of condescending way. I'm not saying this as if you will inevitably come along with how I do things. I'm simply saying I used to do what you do in terms of the willingness of the dialogue. And you reach a point where you just go, I'm tired.
I've said that before. Listen, if I get tired, I'm gonna just start sending people links. Like, go watch me in 2022 when I cared.
I got to the point where I specifically said I am talking to men. That doesn't mean that women can't listen. Obviously, I'm on YouTube. I can't control that.
Right.
I'm against women listening. But if you come up in my space trying to mommy men and tell them what they need to do, you're gonna get bounced. This is not, not that space, because you're not who I'm talking to. I'm talking to men because even when they disagree, you know, and even when some want to be disingenuous enough about, you know, their reasons for disagreeing, if I dig deep enough, I can find that you actually understand everything I'm saying. You may not agree with what to do about it, but you can't pretend after a certain point that you don't understand what I'm talking about. And like I said, when I got hardcore conservatives, hardcore revolutionaries, liberal folk, those in the middle, those who are apolitical or atheists, when I got men on every part of the spectrum that can say, yeah, I've had that experience.
Yep.
I know what that feels like. Yes, my mother talked to me this way. Yes, the women in my family did me this way. Yes, the girlfriends and the wives I've had did this, and this. When you can see those men who can agree on far too many things, that's when you know this is not some shit that we just making up. This ain't some, you know, black women have attitudes, we're tired of it. It's way beyond that.
Yep.
It's way beyond that. This is actually a critical point for the black community, and I agree with you on that. It is critical. I'm a bit skeptical about whether or not women are willing to do the work that they've demanded men do for the last 40 to 50 years. I really don't think that too many women are down to do that internal work. I mean, what they call internal work is really the shit that they feel like dealing with. But actually, listen to men and respond to what men are actually saying and take it seriously and do it in earnest. I don't see very many women doing that. And that's what makes me skeptical. You know, and I'm not happy about being skeptical. I'm just skeptical because I don't see it. But they've made these demands on men for decades. And I'm just like, y'all are some real interesting creatures. That's a lot of arrogance. You don't sit up here and tell men everything they're doing wrong, but you don't even want to hear what they have to say. And when you finally have to hear it, you still putting your hands over your ears and saying niggas ain't shit. And I'm just looking at it like, okay, well, okay. Good luck. The first men to leave are the men who can. The second men to leave are the men who will find a way.
Right.
And the men that are left, well,
right.
I'm just, hey, it is what it is.
Man. Again, thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Y'all definitely go subscribe to Dr. T. Hasan Johnson's YouTube channel ASAP. I'm gonna put the link in the chat. We'll be having a conversation over there Monday. So y'all be sure to tune into that. Monday, 9 o'clock Eastern, 6 o'clock Pacific. Yeah, man. I'm excited to watch this back because I don't think I picked everything up. It's like a really good freestyle. You might have missed some double entendres. So like, man.
I hope there's some value to it. You know, I'm not trying to hurt people, but I really do want Black men to be heard, and really
Absolutely.
that's my contribution to, whether the community thrives or falls apart. My contribution is y'all gonna hear these brothers.
That's facts.
You're gonna hear
That's
them.
facts.
So
And part of what I've been saying is the reason why Black men have been silenced. It works in service of the white power
oh
structure.
yes,
The
absolutely.
reason why Black women have been, pedestalized works in the service of the white power structure.
Absolutely.
So if we skip that context and we're just bickering amongst ourselves,
Right.
we're doing, what I mean? We're essentially just doing what they want us to do.
Well, and that's why we talk about Robert Staples. That's why we talk about Errol Miller and James Sedanius and Anthony Lamell and Tommy J. Curry. We talk about these scholars in Black male studies because for generations they've been explaining why Black men in particular have been attacked. This is critical. This is a critical piece to it. It's not arbitrary. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It isn't because white society woke up one day and they just said, I don't like Black men. No, there was a structural reason why Black men and women were treated differently, why Black men and women were targeted differently with different strategies. The illusion of middle class access for women, while the material denial and rebutting of Black men from being able to participate in society on certain terms. These are not accidental things by any measure. These are very strategic and structured, and they pan out in terms of our behavior and our relationships, but they actually come from structural practices. So, today we're just kind of having a conversation, but, we've been doing this for years, on my channel, BGS Ibmore's channel, Green Gorilla's channel, Dr. Ronald Neal, and many others, where we've been having these policy conversations about when certain laws were put into place, when certain practices were put into place, what the reasonings behind that were, because there's so many levels to this.
Yes.
You're absolutely right. And we don't dodge the context that you're talking about. It's an important part of the conversation. But at the end of the day, it's a rot that is at this point coming from within the community as much as it's coming from outside. And we have to be able to be aware of that. So when I teach Africana studies, right? So we've been dealing with this history, for years. And so we've talked about race, we've talked about class, we've talked about, feminism, we've talked about LGBT, we've talked about, but one of the things we haven't talked about are the ways the gender dynamics have been implemented to play against the best interests of the community, and how central undermining Black men and Black manhood has been to that dynamic. And a lot of people dismiss it as, oh, that's just some macho, whatever. No, it's critical. When you actually can convince men they have no value and convince women that men have no value either. Huge.
My God. Y'all be sure to tune in Monday. I'm excited to know what your questions of me are. Because I'm honored that you even see what I'm doing and you find value in it. So we're gonna keep pushing this forward.
Oh yeah, no, I appreciate you, man, because I can't do it. I'm like, hey. I watched a couple of discussions. I was like, nah, man, listen, I don't know how you doing it.
I'm young enough where I'm not as I'm not as jaded yet.
Not jaded.
Sometimes I get close. I'm not gonna lie. Sometimes I get even the interview I did today. I recorded an interview today. It started off very frustrating. We got somewhere, but my God, I know it may appear that way. It's not really jadedness as far as me. There's a certain exhaustion with having certain conversations. I remember if you ever watched the movie Malcolm X, toward the end, right before he died, I think he was standing outside of the Audubon ballroom, and an older woman walked up to him and said, Jesus loves you. And you kind of saw this look on his face where he's like, I'm a Muslim. I've been talking about Christianity for years. And, you know what I mean? There's a point where you just go, okay, I get it. But it's akin to that, where it's just there's certain conversations I've had so many times I can't have them anymore. And there's another level of conversation that I'm more willing to have. And I don't care. I mean, if it comes from, a beautiful sister right here from Cali, or if it comes from someone from across the world, if I can have that conversation, you got my attention. But if it's going to be the same old, disparaging Black men dynamic, I'm exhausted more so than jaded. Right.
Yeah. But anyway, brother, I appreciate it. Thank you for
Thank
having
you
me.
so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. I will see you. I'll see you Monday, and I'll see y'all there as well.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. All right. Good night, brother.
Good night.
All right. All right, guys. So, like I said, please make sure to go over to Dr. Johnson's channel and hit that subscribe button. Watch some content. I've been a fan of that man long before I was relevant, on YouTube. So, please go over there, show him some love. The titles alone are captivating. So go check out his content. Tune in Monday on his channel, Monday, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. Apparently, he's got some questions for me. I'm honored. So I'm looking forward to that conversation. I learned a great deal from this conversation. I will actually be watching it back. I don't know if I'm going to hit the road tonight to Atlanta, but there's a project I'm shooting tomorrow. It's going to be powerful. It's going to be coming soon. I'll probably drop it on or around Father's Day, so you guys be on the lookout for that. Thank you guys so much. All the super chats. I know I didn't get around to shouting you guys out, but you are appreciated. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Everybody in the chat, thank you. You guys have a phenomenal weekend. Have a good evening, and we'll see you Monday. Bye-bye.